Thank you, Mr. President. I arrived in Somalia on the 3rd of October and had been well received by prominent officials of the federal government and of the regional states. I have been impressed with the federal government's far-reaching reform agenda and their commitment to practical implementation through roadmaps for delivery in each relevant sector. Somalia has maintained a positive trajectory, but continuing political turbulence could throw it off course. In December, the IMF completed its first review of the third staff-monitored program, noting satisfactory performance by the federal government. In recognition of the country's significant progress, the World Bank's 2019-22 Country Partnership Framework unlocked International Development Association financing through pre-arrears clearance grants totaling 80 million to strengthen basic service delivery, improve financial management capabilities, and restore economic resilience. Improvements in public financial management and an expansion of the domestic revenue base, with a recorded fiscal balance surplus of 8 million in September, means that 56% of the federal government's 340 million budget for 2019 will be financed from domestic revenue, with the rest provided by donors. I want to commend the Office of the Prime Minister for leading government efforts to tackle corruption, including the announcement on the 9th of December of the federal government's intention to ratify the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. Turning to political progress, the roadmap on inclusive politics covers elections, the constitutional review, federalism and reconciliation. These are essential elements for Somalia's state-building project. The draft electoral law has been submitted to the Cabinet, and amendments from political parties, civil society and the international community have been provided. The delay in submitting the draft electoral law to Parliament will see a key milestone missed, as per the government's commitment to have the electoral law adopted by December 2018. This will have a possible impact on the timelines for the electoral process. However, the National Independent Electoral Commission is still making headway with pre-voter registration preparations, including recruitment and training of new staff. The planning of the mapping of voter registration sites and the establishment and consolidation of its subnational structure. So far, 35 political parties have been registered. Technical cooperation has continued on the constitutional review process, laying the groundwork for real progress at the national level. The Federal National Technical Committee has been negotiating draft political agreements on justice, mineral resource sharing, allocation of powers and fiscal federalism. Women's meaningful participation in these decisions is essential. Members of the Women's Caucuses from both houses of Federal Parliament recently held a second annual conference for women representatives of federal and state assemblies to consider the constitutional review process and preparations for the national elections. Mr. President, despite these positive developments, the stalemate between the federal government and the federal member states continues to impede concrete progress in defining the federal model, building institutions of state, and in the implementation of the national security architecture. The halt to cooperation between the MGS, between the federal government and the federal member states, was announced by the Council of Interstate Cooperation on the 8th of September. After visits to all the regions by Ambassador Madeira and myself, there have been encouraging Somali-led initiatives to restore relations. President Farmajo offered direct dialogue behind closed doors, and in October, Prime Minister Kaire established a 6-member ministerial committee to work with the upper house to end the stalemate. However, the landscape is complicated by electoral processes that are currently underway in several of the member states. Politics is complex in any nation, but in one that is still establishing its norms, institutional parameters, and still debating the responsibilities of its respective governance structures, there is a risk that complexity shifts to conflict. We witnessed this during the electoral process in South West State. allegations of interference by the federal government, and the violence which erupted following the arrest of one of the candidates, a former al-Shabaab deputy leader, marred the process and does not bode well for the upcoming electoral processes in other regions or for the 2020 national elections. This may also have implications for the likelihood of future al-Shabaab defectors who may be considering exchanging violence for a political path. Regrettably, 15 people, including a regional assembly member, were killed during the violence. Strains between the executive and the legislature also came to the surface on the 9th of December, when members of the House of the People submitted a motion for the impeachment of President Farmajo. Completing the demanding legislative agenda requires continued cooperation between the executive and legislature. Discord between the two can seriously hinder Somali's progress. I welcome the recent progress made, however, on the passage of the 2019 budget and the pension law before Parliament adjourned for recess. Mr. President, I strongly condemn the mortar attack on our premises that took place 2 days ago and the casualties caused by such use of force. In no country are attacks against the United Nations acceptable. As you are aware, 3 of our staff were injured, 1 seriously but not critically. You may also be aware that the responsibility for this attack was claimed by al-Shabaab. I welcome the federal government's condemnation of the attack. Al-Shabaab remains the biggest source of insecurity in Somalia. Despite the ongoing operations to degrade the terrorist group, it still has the capacity to conduct indiscriminate attacks on Somali citizens and to target electoral delegates, the Somali security forces, and AMISOM. AMISOM and the Somali security force operations have succeeded in denying al-Shabaab the possibility of launching conventional attacks. It now relies on improvised explosive devices and targeted assassinations. Of note, on 9th of November, al-Shabaab claimed responsibility for a complex attack against the Sahafi Hotel in Mogadishu, initiated by 3 vehicle-borne IEDs. Over 50 people, including 7 al-Shabaab militants, were killed in the attack. In Mogadishu and Puntland, pro-ISIS elements have targeted business owners using extortion to extract revenue and conducting assassinations. It appears that the cause of the conflict between the 2 extremist groups is now primarily driven by financial interests. Their focus is now on extortion of so-called taxes. In addition to military operations, it is therefore important to tackle this aspect as well as the infrastructure used by al-Shabaab to assemble IEDs. There has been some progress in building the institutional capacity of the security sector to tackle these threats. Biometric registration programs for the Somali National Army and the Somali Police Force are forging ahead. An operational readiness assessment of the regional forces is underway, and these processes will hopefully assist the mapping of regional capabilities ahead of future integration of these forces into the national security architecture. Implementation of the transition plan made an encouraging start but has recently slackened. There will need to be a more comprehensive and better coordinated planning process to achieve the more ambitious transition locations in the timelines contained in the Somali Transition Plan. This must be guided by respect for human rights, appropriate measures towards stabilization, all as agreed in the Transition Plan. Overall, the approach to transition should be conditions-based, with progress in building effective Somali security institutions as the main factor setting the pace. We have continued to support conflict resolution and conflict prevention efforts in several parts of the country in collaboration with other partners. IGAD and UNSOM engaged in shuttle diplomacy between Puntland and Somaliland to help them de-escalate the tension in Tukarek and find a sustainable solution. As a result of the joint mediation effort, de facto ceasefire is holding. On the regional level, the tripartite agreement signed between the leaders of Somalia, Ethiopia and Eritrea on the 6th of September is an opportunity for Somalia to strengthen its regional ties and provide further support to Somalia's economic, political, and security progress. Mr. President, the humanitarian crisis in Somalia remains amongst the most complex and long-standing in the world. Armed conflict and widespread violence, as well as recurrent climatic shocks, perpetuate high levels of humanitarian need and protection concerns. While the humanitarian situation has improved compared to last year, due to the above-average GU rains, the needs remain high, with 4.2 million people in need of assistance and protection. Of those who need assistance and protection services, almost two-thirds are children. Around 1.5 million are severely food insecure at crisis or emergency levels. Around 2.6 million people are internally displaced. The 2019 Humanitarian Response Plan, to be announced this month, targets 3.4 million people, or 81% of the 4.2 million people in need of assistance, requiring $1.1 billion for its implementation. Mr. President, respect for human rights and international humanitarian law and the protection of civilians in the context of the conflict remains key for Somalia's transition and sustainable peace. UNSOM has documented 1,384 civilian casualties in 2018, with Al-Shabaab accounting for 60% of these. Progress has been made, including taking steps to establish institutions that protect human rights, such as the Federal Independent National Human Rights Commission. I encourage the federal government to finalize the Commission's foundation. Mr. President, Somalia has laid the foundations to make significant progress in 2019. The plans are in place and the milestones are clear. The management of the upcoming regional elections in 2019 and the remaining political processes, particularly the review of the Constitution, will determine whether Somalia makes further progress or not. Achieving this will require all role players to pull in the same direction. Somalia has set that direction, and I hope that you will be updated on the progress in the year to come. Thank you.
I would also like to take this opportunity to congratulate the new members of this Council and wish them all success in their term. I would like to begin by first expressing Somalia's strong condemnation of the recent mortar attack on Aden Abdullah Usman International Airport in Mogadishu that hit the UN compound. We reassure the Security Council that our law enforcement agencies promptly began investigation with a view to bring the perpetrators to justice. We wish the injured a swift recovery, and we stand in solidarity with the UN family at this time. I also want to thank the SRSG, Mr. Nicholas Haysom, and SRCC, Mr. Madeira, for their valuable and comprehensive briefings today. Mr. President, since that last Council briefing, Somalia, led by President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo, has continued to irrefutably progress on all fronts. Somalia's forward momentum has been achieved with strong support of our partners. We pay tribute to the continuing commitment and sacrifice of AMISOM personnel, and we are grateful for the collaboration and the support of the United Nations, the African Union, and the European Union, and all our international partners. I today wish to bring your attention the significant development we have achieved with your collaboration. With close to 2 years under the bridge, we have advanced the organizational structure for the implementation of our government's agenda through 4 distinct roadmaps: inclusive politics, security and justice, economic recovery, and social development. These roadmaps have enabled the government to track implementations and improve coordination between ministries and agencies, enhance accountability and transparency at all levels, and most critically, will allow Somalis to streamline the support received from our international partners. Mr. President, following the 73rd session of United Nations General Assembly, Somalia was elected member of the Human Rights Council for a 3-year term beginning this month. On this occasion, Somalia reaffirms its commitment at the national and global levels to the implementation, promotion, protection of human rights. The principles and standards common to all enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and relevant international instruments. In October, Somalia acceded to a convention on the rights of the persons with disability, becoming the 178th country to do so. The same month, our Parliament has approved the draft law prepared by the Ministry of Human Rights, and it was signed by the President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo on December 31st. It's a milestone and a tremendous achievement for our country and a great step to promote and ensure a full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and the fundamental freedoms by all persons living with disabilities in Somalia. Directly attributable to this new mode of business, let me also highlight other key achievements we have made. Somalia is rebranding and taking its rightful place in the region. The end of 2018 marked as an exciting time of regeneration and partnership in the Horn of Africa. This new reality will increase regional cooperation to boost economic initiatives and promote peace and security across the Horn of Africa. The agreement is an example of an active role that Somalia can play in the region under President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo's leadership. On inclusive politics, we have laid important foundations of our reform agenda by reaching agreement on the electoral system for 2020 and completing 50% of the constitutional review process. To put in place the legislative framework for the election, we have reviewed the political parties law and drafted electoral law. On deepening federalism, various elections are underway in many federal member states and are taking place as scheduled, while we continue to support the devolution of government functions and powers to the different administrative levels of government. Our working relationship with our federal member states are getting stronger. We are implementing a jointly developed framework for security support with Hirshabelle State and are currently finalizing the same with Southwest State. Building the trust of the Somali citizen in their government is a key part of our political reform, including through the tackling crippling corruption. In this regard, we have passed an anti-corruption law and established anti-corruption commission, and the cabinet endorsed the federal justice and corrections model, a key step to strengthen the rule of law in Somalia. And to deepen federalism and practical issues, we reached a resource management agreement on the ownership, management, and sharing of fisheries, petroleum, and mineral resources. Lastly, to build a trust between Somalis and make our political reforms genuinely inclusive, my president has led a reconciliation effort across the country. In the city of Galkayo in central Somalia, the president brought the parties together to resolve the conflict and broken relations. To resolve the conflict, and the government has followed up with integration of local forces to enhance the peace. In Tukaraq, in the northwestern part of Somalia, the president is leading a mediation effort to de-escalate the tensions. And in the district of Merka in Lower Shabelle, his support has strengthened local community reconciliation initiative and benefited Lower Shabelle security along the coastal line. On the security front, the federal government of Somalia has made considerable progress in the implementation of the Somali Transitional Plan and the National Security Architecture. Through the Security and the Justice Roadmap, we have broken down the task into priority areas to ensure that activities are not implemented on an ad hoc basis, but are concentrated in areas and aligned to other security efforts in order to multiply the effect. The Somali National Army has conducted independent operations in support of the transitional implementation in Lower Shabelle and Middle Shabelle. Key areas such as the coastal town of Merka were cleared and are being held by SNA to enable stabilization, peace building, and reconciliation initiatives. The implementation of the transition has also continued in the capital, with the Somali police forces taking over the security responsibility of the Mogadishu Stadium from AMISOM. We, the federal government, has restructured the National Intelligence Agency to a civilian intelligence gathering agency, moving operational units to the Somali police force. This is no mean feat. In line with our reform agenda, the House of the People just this week approved pension and gratuity bill that will pave the way for the disengagement and large number of inactive civil servants. We continue to restructure the Somali security forces and redefine their roles and responsibilities in support of the payroll reform, the biometric registration, and our national registration force is nearing completion. On economic recovery, the federal government of Somalia has achieved success due to our relentless fight against corruption through widespread economic reforms. For the first time in many years, high-ranking officials have been arrested and charged in the connection with embezzlement. The Minister of Finance is now the only line ministry entrusted with revenue collection that were previously collected by different government institutions. Domestic revenue has increased. Taxes and government fees are paid directly to the Central Bank of Somalia. As a result of these key policies and strengthening fiscal discipline, our tax base has expanded. A staff-level agreement has been reached with IMF on the completion of the third staff monitoring program, SMP3, thus making significant progress to pave the way for a debt relief. In partnership with the UN, World Bank, and EU, we have developed the Resilience and Recovery Framework as a medium to long-term economic, social responsibility to vulnerability. We are stepping up our efforts to prepare 9th National Development Plan, structured around 4 key roadmaps. It will serve as a basis for an interim poverty reduction strategy paper, document that will lay out the Somali development goals, challenges, and financing requirements. In our efforts to achieve a prosperous society through the Social Development Roadmap, we're working to establish policies, strategies, and regulations for the enhancement of affordable and accessible basic social services such as health, education, clean water, and electricity. In line with this roadmap, we are working on reinstating Somali pride and ownership in the rebuilding of our state through our flagship campaign, Isxilqaan, or simply put, a social mobilization. This program creates civic engagement and enhances the culture of volunteerism. For the first time in our national budget, we have tripled the budget for the delivery of basic social services such as health and education for our people. Mr. President, much of the progress listed above has been achieved with a minimum direct investment and partnership with the federal government of Somalia. Real partnership requires commitment, trust, mutual respect. Our past close to 2 years, we have listened carefully to our partners, and we continue to encourage an open and frank dialogue. We acknowledge and offer our appreciation to the UN agencies that continue to provide vital support and assistance to the Somali people. Somalia is a proud member of the United Nations since its independence in 1960 and is committed to the value and principles enshrined with the UN Charter. Moreover, the principles of the respect for the rule of law, freedom of expression and assembly, fairness, good governance, transparency, and due process are all enshrined in our provisional constitution. Ultimately, Our leaders' decisions are subject to close scrutiny by our legislative and judiciary systems. This robust check and balance, while protecting the separation of powers, also ensure accountability and fairness. Recognizing that our government obtains legitimacy, first and foremost from its people, we have ensured that the public engagement is a critical pillar in our approach to governance. That's why this government enjoys the confidence and overwhelming support of the Somali people. Our youthful nation is finding its voice and establishing new form of debate and active accountability through the public forums. We are proud of our active and vocal citizens, and we encourage their engagement with their government and elected officials. We finally believe that our legitimacy, our credibility, ultimately the impact of our decisions depend on the wishes and interests of our people. The Somali people want Somalia to have its rightful place in the community of nations, and with that aspect, a mutual respect and reciprocity, the Somali people demand that their government assume responsibility for its own decisions and shape their future. Somalia, leading international support, not international support leading Somalia. We therefore have a duty to re-establish Somalia's position in the world and to represent Somalia's interests actively in the world stage. For the pride and protection of the Somali people, we have a duty as their representative to give them a voice and represent their wishes and aspirations. Mr. President, allow me to address the issue at hand. Somalia distinguishes between the institutions that we are part of and individualist conduct or individual conduct that has a detrimental effect on our fragile nations. Our government is taking Somalia to a new future. It's no more of transitional nature, but a sovereign nation with all its rights and privileges. We are battling against terrorism, clan mentalities, and corruptions. It's our expectation that the leadership of the UN will support that strategic picture. Mr. President, the member states here will agree the proscribed individuals from Al-Shabaab or other terrorist organizations sanctioned by this very institution cannot assume leadership positions without going through a stringent established rehabilitation program. During the last two federal electoral cycles, your representatives in Mogadishu have reiterated again and again that the candidature and potential election of any individual with violent extremism history will represent a regressive step. Therefore, while we strive to reestablish the rule of law and end of culture of impunity, we reject the criticism and attempt to rebrand renewed terrorism as an ice cream salesperson without redeeming themselves. Finally, as a maturing nation undergoing a challenging evolution, we do not shy away from the task ahead of us, as we are hard at work laying foundations for generations to come. The federal government of Somalia remains committed to our reform agenda to establish effective institutions that abide by our constitution, respect the human rights of all citizens, adhere to international humanitarian laws, and create forces that are accountable, transparent, and able to defend the people, sovereignty, territorial integrity, political independence, and unity of Somalia. In these endeavors, we continue to promote the respect of human rights and commit to fully investigate any forms of violations, abuses against our people. Mr. President, the challenge facing Somalia are complex, but gradually Somalia is taking the lead in addressing them through Somali-led initiative. As we fulfill our responsibility as a sovereign nation, I recall that speakers of this chamber often call for host government to act on their responsibility to govern and for the national solutions to challenges. Somalia has demonstrated a strong political will to do so. This should be applauded, not extinguished. Somalia continued to make a considerable progress across ambitious and challenging reform agenda. We cannot do so alone. We are grateful for the support of international partners and their commitment to Somalia. This support will be most effective when it's delivered in line with objectives we have set out in our roadmap and when it's directed toward the Somali priorities. We look forward to continue to work closely with our partners to ally their support, build a rich and bright, prosperous future for Somalia. I cannot conclude my remarks without once again reiterating our appeal to the Security Council that the UN and its representatives have duty, even obligation, to respect their mandate and do not interfere in our internal affairs, and let the Somalis control their own destiny. We believe that collaboration with the United Nations on this basis is more likely to bring concrete, positive outcome. With the help of our partners, Somalia is on the right path to recovery from several decades of civil war and anarchy. The Somali government is committed to bringing political stability to the country and will take the necessary measures to maintain those hard-earned gains in accordance with our constitutional and international law. I thank you.
Doy las gracias.
I thank the representative of Somalia for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite Council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.